Welcome to the Rocket PD podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. I'm a longtime education journalist and co-founder of Rocket PD, here to bring you real talk with educators confronting what's broken in America's schools and hopefully offering up some advice and solutions about how to help fix it. Whether you're out to engage families, center students in their learning, or empower teachers and staff, we're going to cover the gamut, giving you ideas and frameworks that you can start using today. So what do you say? Are you ready to launch? Then let's get into it.
Change. Everyone loves the feel good, the why. And hey, I do keynotes all the time and I know the role of that. But here's the thing. When change is focused on a high level feel good message.
Eric Sheninger is the founder of Aspire Change EDU and author of books like Personalized and Disruptive Thinking. A former school principal, Eric helped turn New Jersey's New Milford High School into a model for school innovation. He's become one of the nation's leading voices on school change and transformation.
What is often missing is context, the reality, of what a district, a system, or a school actually is going through. So it sounds great in theory, but the change never materializes because of the lack of practicality.
On this episode of the Rocket PD podcast, Eric and I take on the subject of change in schools. And he shares a strategy designed to move school leaders away from fancy rhetoric toward practical on-the-ground improvements. Rather than promote buy-in for big initiatives, Eric says schools need to promote ownership among teachers and staff, and he shares a plan for just how to do that.
So we have the sandwiching that inhibits change. We have the why, and again, there's so many why messages that really lack substance. And that's what leaders want. They don't want to know the why anymore. They know why we need to change. They want to know, how can we do it effectively and what can it look like?
At the end, Eric tells us about a group he's pulling together later in the fall to model change-based leadership in schools. Stick around. Eric, great to have you. I know we're talking about a pretty cool topic today and a pretty prescient topic today, given all the change that's taking place in the world, because we are talking about change in schools. There's tons of change that's going on in schools right now. There's change being done to us. As a result, educators are going to be faced with making a lot of change in their schools. But change is something that's easy to talk about and often hard to do. And I was excited to get you on the episode today because I know this is your work. I mean, you founded Aspire Change EDU. You've written books like Personalization, Disruptive Thinking. You've been a principal, so you've been on the ground and you've watched sort of the process of change. You and I have talked about the importance of change and the difficulty of change in schools. And so I know, again, there's a big difference between talking about change, which is easy to do, and making it happen. So tell me from your perspective, why is change such a difficult thing to see actually take place in schools?
Man, well, first, Corey, thanks for having me. And
you got it.
It's such a loaded question because there's not one right or best way to attack it. So I'm going to try to provide multiple different scenarios that kind of lead to why we spin our wheels in a sense. The first is, when it comes to change, there are people that really work hard. They're working really hard as administrators, as teachers, trying to move the needle with improved outcomes. But the one question we have to ask is, are we doing the right work? If we continue to do what we've always done, we'll continue to get what we've always gotten. And, a lot of it is the flavor of the month, the latest fad. And people put so much time and effort into it, but it becomes, sandwiched on top of initiative after initiative after initiative. And it's hard to see the forest through the trees. So that is one thing. The other is, change. Everyone loves the feel good, the why. And hey, I do keynotes all the time and I know the role of that. But here's the thing. When change is focused on a high level feel good message, what is often missing is context, the reality, of what a district, a system, or a school actually is going through. So it sounds great in theory, but the change never materializes because of the lack of practicality. So we have the sandwiching that inhibits change. We have the why, and again, there's so many why messages that really lack substance. And that's what leaders want. They don't want to know the why anymore. They know why we need to change. They want to know, how can we do it effectively and what can it look like? And finally, a lot of change does not materialize because of three things. And I call these the big three. Number one, there's a lack of clarity and expectations. There has to be clear, concrete expectations that align to the why, the how, and the what. Number two, there has to be accountability for growth. Change will not happen if there is not accountability for growth. And number three, there has to be professional learning that's job embedded, that's ongoing, aligned to research and evidence-based. Without those three things, like you said, we just continue to talk about change.
I have been, at these conferences. I was a journalist for many years. I went to ISTE and AASA and ASCD, and I loved hearing those speeches. To your point, you go into those large conference rooms and you hear these speeches and you do get excited and you walk out of those events, you feel really powerful. But 3-4 days later, you go back to your desk and you sit down and you start thinking about, what am I supposed to do? So let me ask you this. Whose responsibility is it? Is this a top-down process where the superintendent needs to be communicating to the principals, needs to be communicating to the teachers? What does this look like in terms of the hierarchy of change, and how do you direct it?
Yeah, I'm not big on top down, and no one is, because then that kind of leads to a sense of micromanagement. This is their initiative, their focus. So I'm a really big believer in shared ownership and, and collective efficacy as we think about from a leadership lens. And I think when we look at where we're going to go, the vision, that has to be a collaborative process, because often there's a disconnect between what, say, central office might think is important and what a teacher or a building leader might see. And that's not a negative. When we think about change happens in our classrooms. It doesn't happen because you have a position, title, or power. Leadership is about action, and we have to remember that. And we need to bring in those voices. But here's the thing. We have to really have a sound pulse on what is it that actually can be that area of growth. Case in point, yesterday I was in Ohio, and this is a 2-year project working with the district. And before I even got on the plane yesterday, after meandering through 5 different flight changes because of the weather, that school got a 3,600 word report based on observing every single elementary classroom. Those observations went back to the targeted professional learning that had been implemented last year and this year, the evidence that was collected, and it provided sound commendations that reflected growth based on evidence, and those accommodations on where they've grown, but also where those areas, those consistent areas where they could still move the needle. And now it's up to the admin team to really look at, okay, it's April. What are we going to do with this information now? How are we going to get in classrooms more? And how are we going to begin to set the stage for the targeted professional learning that is needed next year? It's the evidence. It's the classroom visits. It's the conversation with students, teachers, administrators. It's looking at, is the data that's being collected, is it being used to group, regroup, target instruction, differentiate? Is that data truly a part of a PLC process, or is it glorified common planning? But these are the things. When we think about change, it has to be on reality. It has to be based on evidence, and then using research-based strategies so that people see it's not another thing they need to do. It's something that, hey, I'm going to be empowered to move through this change. And one other thing about change, Corey, going back to your question, administrators don't change people. We don't change people. We create the conditions where people want to change because they see the value. If we just wave magic wand and say, hey, you're going to go change, you're going to do this, it will not happen. So how do we create that value? Research, evidence, accountability, feedback.
So you're looking at the information that's in front of you and the information that you have. As a leader, you're using that information to essentially create the conditions and the environment for change. That's a really important piece. I think sometimes, at least when I visited schools, you hear people talking about, we don't really know. One hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, right? I think that happens a lot. You go and you talk in the front lines in schools and you see where people are frustrated and they'll say, we don't know what the administration is doing. You go and you talk to the administration and they'll say, yeah, we're having a hard time communicating this to our frontline educators. So how do you make it so it's a situation where one hand really is talking to the other in an effective way so that you can get to that point where not only are you seeing the data that you know has necessitated change, but you're communicating that in a way that gets everybody sort of on board with it?
Yeah, I think it's really about painting a holistic picture. You can have a vision and a strategic plan, but you kind of hit the nail on the head. You have to have effective communication. You will not find an effective leader who's not an effective communicator. And communication is embedded in how we build relationships with our people. It's about transparency. It's about empathy. When we think about building those relationships, it's so key. And, often change, the impetus for change comes from data. Oh my goodness, our achievement data, it is not good. We got to close these subgroups. Here's what we're going to do. But the missing piece is, okay, well, let's start peeling away the layers and let's actually see what is happening in our classrooms, what is happening with instruction, what the teacher does, what is happening with learning, what the students do, and how do we begin to really look at the pedagogical pathways that may or may not be embedded in practice. Let's look at how are we evaluating teachers in a way that motivates them to improve. How are administrators? Hey, if we want change to happen, you'd be surprised how many administrators are not evaluated consistently. They're not being given feedback. Now, we can sit here, point fingers. Here's the thing about change, honesty and vulnerability. And a lot of that comes into how we communicate. We have to be honest, and there has to be shared responsibility and say, hey, everybody, you know what? We can grow. We can improve outcomes for our kids. This is a collective effort. Here's how we are going to do this. Here's what we are going to do at central office. Here's what our building administrators are going to do. And here are our expectations for teachers. However, here are the tiered supports that we are going to provide you because change is not a one-size-fits-all approach. That's another reason why it does not work. And the magic of the job-embedded ongoing professional learning is that it's personalized, it's tailored, it's customized. Every classroom, school, district looks different. So we have to move away. And so many districts and schools invest in a broad brush approach. It is standardized, and we know how that works out for our kids. So we have to look through different lenses. But again, it comes back to the communicating, the why, the how, and the what.
I want to ask you something because you and I have talked about this before, and it's kind of interesting because what you just described, the process that folks go through, you might call that in some cases trying to secure buy-in. You and I talked about in a previous conversation the difference between buy-in and what we would call ownership. How do you get to a point in a district? Because oftentimes this happens. Again, you get the communication that's coming down and you're not getting that ownership from people to carry the mantle forward down to the students, out to the parents? How do you create a sense of ownership in a school building, a school district, so that people know and understand their roles and they carry that mission forward?
Yeah, and I think when we look at how we tackle change, it's, hey, how are we going to get people to buy into it? And the work of Dan Pink really got me to rethink the term buy-in. Buy-in is where you have to use extrinsic means, carrots and sticks, if-then rewards. You have to try to convince people, but when it comes to change, if we want people to own the process, they have to embrace it. And embracement is instilling that sense of value. And if people see that this is truly going to save them time, change, another reason why it doesn't happen often is because people see that it's a time sap. How will it save time while maximizing outcomes? So when we think about that buy-in piece, if I have to convince you continuously to do A, B, C, and D, that's going to be a lot of time on my end, especially if the results don't follow. But if I can lead you to your own assertion as, hey, if I start implementing closure in the form of an exit ticket consistently at the end of my lessons, I can get valuable feedback whether or not my students understood the concepts in that standard. I then can use that formative data to determine if not only my lesson was successful, but if I have to do a reteach the next day. And I can do that continuously to ensure that my lesson is effective. Closure is not new. Closure is not another thing. But my point here is it comes back to consistency and continuity.
Yeah.
And people don't want new. So when we think about that embracement, it's going back to tried and true strategies. It's taking complex issues and making them more simplistic. It is the ongoing, the timely, practical feedback, engaging people in conversations, using questions. Nobody likes to be told what to do. Oh, and here's the thing about change. Everyone says they want feedback, but most people are really not open to feedback. So when we have difficult conversations, how do we tackle that? We ask questions. And by asking questions, we can lead people to their own understanding of where they can move the needle.
Interesting that it's not this binary thing. It's not I've made change or I haven't. What you're talking about is a feedback loop that identifies sort of the gaps, right? And then allows people to figure out how to make change in their context, which is pretty cool. Whether you're a teacher or an administrator or a student, even when you begin to understand the gaps that you have, you can fill those gaps with knowledge. And then that creates change. That's pretty cool. I was going to ask you about this concept that you've written about and we've talked about, but the Swiss Army knife approach to change, right? Because I think that kind of gets with this thinking, this notion that it's not sort of a one size fits all approach when you talk about change. That's easy to do, but you need to have different strategies and practices that work for different people.
Yeah, we're made to think in education that we have to abide by best practices. That's a fallacy. Yeah. There's no such thing as a best practice. If there was, we'd be doing it with a high degree of fidelity and getting amazing results. There are effective practices. Why is this important? Because there isn't a best way to lead. There are effective ways to lead. And leadership is extremely dynamic. Some might need to put more emphasis on the vision, the strategic planning. Others, maybe it's communication, but you also have to look at the situation. In some situations, you need to build consensus where you help, bring the masses on board. Other times, you got to model. The thing that's going back to the keynotes, the why, the how. Yeah, let's laugh, let's cry. Well, guess what? Show me. If people are truly interested about change and leadership, show me how this will improve A, B, C, or D. That modeling is critical. What does the professional learning look like? And again, when we think about change, one and done Drive-by PD is not going to work. The research says that over and over again. And the standalone PD days, it's not going to work. So as we look at that Swiss Army knife approach, it's really looking at various aspects. And the professional learning is how we support our people. But, the most effective leaders understand that they need to use the right tool for the right task. And that's why I love that Swiss Army knife analogy. Anyone listening, shoot me an email and I will send you the image and I will send you the blog post.
Yeah, very cool. I loved looking at that image as well. I have to ask you because we're in a it seems like we're always in an interesting time, but here we are talking. This is early spring. There's a lot of change taking place in our country. There's a lot of change taking place at places like the Federal Department of Education. People are nervous, on edge about what that will mean as those changes trickle down into their schools and in their classrooms. You talked about the need to perhaps do things differently to create change. Is that something that is even more so necessitated now, given the environment we're in, or is this just always the environment that we're in?
Well, I think one of the issues that we've had is we've always tried to fit into a box. But if we truly want to own the change process, I'll kind of steal a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. We got to carve our own path. And what path will we follow? And often we follow the path that everyone else is. And that's not going to work for the students we serve because communities are different. And, the one thing I do know, especially here in the United States, is that we don't truly have real accountability. We don't fire and get rid of ineffective administrators and teachers like we should. So the question becomes, what are we afraid of? Are we afraid of decreasing achievement? Are we afraid of how our parents might react? Are we afraid of how our teachers might react? And I think we have to look at how will we get out, beyond the comfort and fear zone. Comfort is the enemy of progress. Fear becomes this sort of invincible barrier that paralyzes us. And, we want to get into the learning and growth zones because that's the only way that we are going to truly implement change. And again, change to me, small shifts to practice done consistently. Let me repeat that. Small shifts to practice done consistently. It is not a big umbrella effort. It's not. And when we look at it from that lens, it helps to alleviate fear. Yeah. It helps to get people become comfortable with getting uncomfortable. And we can truly begin to maximize the time that we have with our students, for teachers, or with our educators if we are administrators.
Well, that's really cool. It does kind of two things just in hearing you talk about this for me as I'm processing, right? It says number one, let's make this manageable. We can do this when we start to break it down into smaller pieces. And then we think about our ownership within those pieces, and then we can execute that. When you look at it as, to your point, a broad-based or broad brush strategy, it's very hard, I would think, for most people to figure out where they fit in that. But when you can break it down into small, manageable chunks and take ownership of those pieces within a larger organization or structure, then things start to play out in a different way. That to me, you wrote the book, right? But that's disruptive thinking, right? We're disrupting the status quo for a different approach to how we might go about actually doing something like this.
Yeah, and it's great that you brought that up because, the definition of disruptive thinking is how do we replace conventional ideas with innovative solutions to authentic problems? And I think we just came full circle and defined what leadership and change really is. Replacing conventional ideas with innovative solutions to authentic problems. And there isn't one right or best way to do it, but we do have to look at, is it the right work? Is it aligned to research? What evidence supports or refutes this emphasis? How do we get people to embrace so they own the process? And then in the end, how do we show efficacy
Yeah.
of the time, the resource that we put in to really show that this has been a worthwhile endeavor.
Now, I got to ask you because, like, I had a surgery once, and I remember I was in the hospital for a while, and then I had to have recovery, and the doctor would say, "Hey, I want you to know, like, you may feel a little bit better tomorrow, but recovery is not a straight line." And I think about change that way a lot too. You may take a few steps forward to take a few steps back to go forward, a few more steps. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I imagine when you're starting to do this work, even if you break it down into manageable chunks and you have a strategy for it, you're going to run into some pushback, or you're going to have some days that aren't as good as the days you had before, but you may have better days later. And so how do you deal with sort of that pushback, that reality that says, like, change is not a straight line, but I need to keep going forward? And then I'll put a caveat on that says, like, I need to keep going forward so long as the data indicates that I should. But, sometimes we have to decide to take another track or tact or pivot from what we were doing based on what we're learning. So how do you manage all that?
I think it begins with understanding that there's no perfection in education. There's no perfect district, strategy, school, system. We have to chase growth, not perfection. And if we're truly honest about where we are, we know we can grow. I worked with a system the other day, 95% proficient or higher. So on face value, oh my goodness, amazing. But they still saw the opportunity to grow. And if we keep it manageable, if we focus on those small shifts, if we focus on consistency and continuity, it just becomes a embedded part of the process, not something that we have to do, something that we want to do. But another challenge is how we kind of tackle the change process. Some people, they just want to be liked. And the people that want to be liked, that do not want to ruffle feathers or rock the cart, they will not be able to empower people to own the process. Then there's the polar opposite, the bull in the china shop, the real demanding, we're going to do this, you're going to do that. And what happens in both cases is a lack of respect. We need to build a culture of respect if we want change to take hold and flourish. And respect means, being firm, but empathetic. And it means that we don't shy away from doing the things that might ruffle feathers. For example, I map out during the coaching process, because part of change is being able to adapt and evolve and provide specific strategies based on what the district and schools are asking for. So I go to my vast toolbox, not from only when I was a principal, but also from the districts and schools that have flourished and seen this change take hold, whatever it is they want to focus on. One of the hardest things I ever did was change the way my teachers graded. But I knew we had a problem. But once we did that and we reduced our failures and we increased achievement to historical highs, it became a part that people, for the most part, embraced and owned it. Not everybody. But that's something, but again, it comes back to everything we talked about, the communication, aligning the research. Here's what the data is telling us. We're failing kids. Kids aren't failing. Here's how we're going to hold ourselves accountable. Here's what the professional learning is going to look like. So we have to tackle those issues, but it's how we tackle those issues in a respectful way that will empower people to own the change process.
I want to talk to you a second when you talk about that respectful way. Sometimes, it can be about sort of taking the personality out of it and putting sort of the goal into it. And you wrote something in a document that I have here that says, like, talk about North Stars, lead with pedagogical purpose, right? This notion that, like, what are we actually all trying to achieve at the end of the day, right? I love this thinking. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about what does that mean, lead with a pedagogical purpose?
Well, we often focus on instructional leadership. Instruction is what the teacher does. Learning is what the kids do. And we have to have a more, holistic view of what it means when we think about teaching, learning, and leadership. So when we think about, the pedagogical pathways that we want teachers to implement, cooperative learning, PBL, personalization, differentiation, those are all strategies that put the emphasis on what the learner is doing. But you first and foremost, you got to build those relationships with your people. Number one. Number two, you got to provide the adequate supports. You got to provide clarity in terms of expectations. Think about it as anchor charts for teachers. And then, you really have to look at how you're going to collect and analyze evidence. Number four, then you collect and analyze evidence. How are you going to provide that feedback? And then finally, number five, the professional learning. Those components are critical. And instruction is embedded in that. Yeah. It is. Instruction, when we think about the supports, we think about just tier one. That's great. But most often, instruction becomes something that the adult is doing to the students. We are delivering instruction. I don't know if kids get excited when their instruction is delivered to them. How do we shift to a facilitation of learning? And, collecting the evidence, the feedback, the professional learning, that leads into creating true professional learning communities that is actually looking at data or evidence to make informed decisions about what should be going on in our classrooms.
When you commit to these strategies, you mentioned some of them, and you start to really create meaningful change in your system, you have people taking ownership, you're doing it in these manageable chunks. How does the mood in the district change? Is there a point where I need less data to tell me the change is happening because I can see it on people's faces or I can feel it in the hallways of my schools and in my district? Is that palpable? Can you feel that? Can you give me an example of how that looks different than what some people are experiencing now?
I don't know about feeling it. I think it's more seeing it.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of looking at, multiple different factors that contribute. There's not one thing. Change is a one-off event.
Yeah.
It's a culmination of various initiatives, various shifts to practice. And I think you could look at, all the different metrics, whether it's achievement data, attendance, discipline, perception surveys from students, from teachers, going into classrooms and being able to take pictures and videos and see high-level thinking, relevant application, being able to go to a PLC and look at how teachers and administrators are looking at the data and making decisions based on what's best for kids, looking at reinventing schedules, building in time for PLCs, for professional learning, improving the feedback mechanism, getting teachers into other classrooms. There's so many different things. But so, yes, I think you can feel it and see it. But I think that's the main thing is if you feel it, let's make sure we have the evidence that aligns with it. So it's not a smoke and mirrors approach, because we really want, what I always tell my schools when I show examples is, here's what it could look like. Yes, this is from one of my projects. This is how I'm showing efficacy in the work. But I don't want you to do it like this school or district. I want you to do it better. That's how you lead for ownership, not telling people, go do it like this school. Here's the idea, tweak it, make it work for your context. And then when people start sharing those examples, one thing that I do in all my coaching cycles is I tell the administrators, begin to curate your own evidence libraries, because that's what's going to empower your people. Because the best resource you have, when you look through that window and you see your people, that is the best resource you have. And there's no better way to build them up than to use their examples, their work in your emails, in your staff meetings, in your professional learning, because that, Corey, creates that feel-good approach based on substance.
I love that. So you kind of suss out these stories from your institution as this starts to happen, but they're all, to your point, evidence-based. So you can go to people and not only say, hey, this happened, isn't it cool? But here's how this happened, and here is what it is helping us achieve. That is a fundamentally different conversation, I think, for a lot of people than, hey, isn't this great? Which is what you get a lot of times from those keynote speeches that we talked about in the very beginning. So we've kind of taken this conversation full circle. I love that you said that. I know that later this fall, you're actually pulling a group together to talk about how does this happen? How can we make this work? Take this work from theoretical to practical in school districts. I'd love for you to tell me a little bit more about that group that you're pulling together and what you're hoping to achieve in case some folks listening to this want to join up.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to break down a lot of the things that we talked about, really looking at how do we create the conditions for high-performing schools, really diving into the Swiss Army knife approach, using tools like SWOT analysis, the Eisenhower matrix, to really think about what are the threats, what are the barriers, how are we utilizing our time, then diving into the framework for pedagogical leadership and looking at those 5 elements I discussed, relationships, how we support our teachers, collecting, analyzing evidence, feedback, professional learning, but really looking at not just the research, but examples from the field, having honest conversations about what's worked, what's not worked, hopefully leaving with clear plans that are going to be measurable. That's the kind of goal with this work is how will people in this cohort leave with an actionable plan that they can begin to implement. So I'll be sharing a lot of, I wouldn't say they're trade secrets or things that are just aligned with me, but I'm going to be walking them through the change process from the lens of a district and a school. Look at where we started, where we are now, how the evidence validates, really looking at how we initiate feedback conversations, how we begin to look at how we can use all that data, how we can actually create self-sustaining job-embedded professional learning that's going to be meaningful, how the leaders can actually lead the professional learning themselves. So it's going to be action-packed. It's going to be so much. They're going to leave with a lot of practical examples from the field that they can turn around and use right away.
Well, very cool. I want to thank you, Eric, for taking a few minutes to chat with me. I know you've been on the road, so I'll let you get back to sort of decompressing here and getting ready for your next adventure. But I want to thank you again for taking a few minutes to chat. If you folks are listening to this and you want to learn more about the cohort that's coming in the fall, I will post the link in the comments. If you're listening to this on Spotify or somewhere else and you don't have the video version, you can go to rocketpd.com to find out more about the cohort that's coming with Eric this fall. Eric, again, I just want to say thank you. I know we'll talk again really soon, but until then, take care of yourself and be good.
Thanks, Corey.
You got it. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rocket PD podcast. I'm your host, Corey Murray. We hope you found today's conversation insightful. If you enjoyed what you heard, consider clicking that like button and subscribing to our channel. You can download the Rocket PD podcast wherever you find your favorite pods. We're also on YouTube. Just search for Rocket PD. At Rocket PD, we're on a mission to empower the world's teachers and staff. To learn more about our work and the community we're building together, visit us anytime at rocketpd.com. If you're an educator and you're listening to this, remember, your work matters. So be well, do right, and let's keep up the fight.